The leaders of South Korea and Japan meet again in Seoul following their recent summit in Tokyo. Among the agreements this time, South Korea to send its delegation to inspect the Fukushima wastewater release. The Japanese PM delivers a rare personal statement on Japan's wartime forced labor issue, but stops short of a direct apology. Seoul and Washington are gearing up to lay out the foundations of a bilateral chip alliance in a follow-up to their recent state summit. Good afternoon. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida met again after their Tokyo summit, this time in Seoul. With this, the long-halted back-and-forth visits have been officially restored as the two countries seek to further mend ties. And among other things, the two also agreed to cooperate on Japan's planned release of Fukushima wastewater, with South Korea to send its delegation for an on-site inspection. Oh Soo-young starts us off.
Seeking emotional reconciliation, South Korea and Japan are taking their next steps to overcome sensitive sticking points as the neighbours mend fences in the face of various geopolitical and economic challenges. At a joint press conference following their summit in Seoul, President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida on Sunday announced key measures to build trust and value-based cooperation.
우리 두 정상은 한일 관계 개선이 양국 국민에게 큰 이익으로 돌아온다는 점을 확인하고 앞으로도 더 높은 차원으로 양국 관계를 발전시켜 나아가는 데 합의했습니다.
Building on their March summit in Tokyo, Yoon and Kishida reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening trilateral cooperation with Washington against growing nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. They acknowledged their ongoing efforts to bolster security cooperation, including information sharing on North Korean missiles. The leaders also recognized joint efforts to launch a new economic security dialogue, youth exchange funding, and new cultural exchanges. Lauding the progress they made in just 2 months, they pledged to expand programs and scholarships for the future generation, as well as the number of flights between the two countries. The two then touched upon sensitive matters. Yoon and Kishida agreed on a South Korean inspection into the safety of the radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant, separate from the ongoing probe under the International Atomic Energy Agency. This comes amid the South Korean public's concern over Japan's plan to release the treated wastewater into the ocean. Japanese media have reported that a Korean inspection team will head to Fukushima on May 23rd. In another move to grow their value-based relationship, the two leaders also plan to visit a memorial park in Hiroshima this month to honor Korean victims of the atomic bomb in 1945, when Yoon attends the G7 summit there later this month upon Kishida's invitation. Both leaders said they looked forward to deepening their cooperation on broader global issues at the G7 meeting.
If you look at the developments in the international community, our bilateral cooperation is essential. At the G7 Hiroshima summit, we will hold a Japan-South Korea-US summit and further deepen our discussions.
Marking the first time in 12 years that a Japanese leader has visited Seoul for a summit, Kishida's 2-day trip has put the so-called shuttle diplomacy in full swing, reciprocating Yoon's visit to Tokyo in March.
It seems there is more shuttling to come as the South Korean president heads to Hiroshima in less than 2 weeks, where he is also expected to hold a 3-way summit with Kishida and Joe Biden. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Though not included as an official agenda item of the summit, much attention was on Japan's wartime forced labor issue. While Prime Minister Kishida made a rare personal statement on the issue, he once again stopped short of a direct apology. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has more.
Unsurprisingly, the message that Japan's Prime Minister Kishida gave on forced labor victims was not that much different from the one he gave when he met President Yoon in March, as he still avoided using the word apology. But for the first time, he did say that he felt heartbroken for those who had to work in difficult conditions, apparently referring to the Korean victims of wartime forced labor.
As I said when President Yoon visited Tokyo in March, our government's stance remains and will continue to remain that we uphold the historical recognition made by previous cabinets, including the joint declaration made in October 1998. My heart aches for those who had to work under difficult conditions at the time.
Japan has been saying that it would continue to, quote, uphold the stance on previous cabinets, including the joint declaration between former leaders of the two countries, made in 1998, without using the word apology. The joint statement between former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi includes Tokyo's deep remorse and heartfelt apology for causing tremendous damage and suffering to Koreans during its colonial rule. In response to Kishida's latest remarks, a senior official from Seoul's presidential office noted that President Yoon expressed gratitude and said he hopes this will enhance cooperation between the two countries. While meeting Kishida on Sunday, he stressed that it's important to let go of the past and move forward.
양국이 과거사가 완전히 정리되지 않으면 미래 협력을 위해 한 발자국도 내디딜 수 없다는 인식에서는 벗어나야 한다고 생각합니다.
Since President Yoon took office in May last year, his administration has been pushing to mend ties with Japan. Seeking to improve relations, the South Korean government in March laid out plans to solve the long-standing dispute over compensation for people subjected to forced labor by Japan, through funds secured by Korean companies instead of the accused Japanese firms. The victims and supporting civic groups protested, saying this issue cannot be resolved without sincere apologies and participation by the Japanese companies that are responsible. But President Yoon on Sunday reiterated that the government is not willing to change its plan on this issue. 배은지, Arirang News.
Closely watching the summit was the U.S., and the U.S. State Department on Sunday welcomed the summit, saying Washington will continue to work with its allies to advance a free and secure Indo-Pacific. According to State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller on Twitter, the U.S. appreciates the leadership of both President Yoon and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida for continuing their push for better bilateral relations. The comments come as President Joe Biden during the ROK-US summit in April praised President Yoon for his decision to improve bilateral ties with Tokyo. Now, after the official summit at the Yongsan presidential office, President Yoon invited Prime Minister Kishida for dinner at his residence. Before returning home this afternoon, Kishida took time to meet with leaders in the political and business circles. Our Kim Do-young reports.
President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida moved their talks to Yoon's official residence following the Paris summit at the Yongsan presidential office on Sunday evening. This is the second official overseas guest at the president's residence, and President Yoon happily shared that the estate was formerly the residence of South Korea's foreign minister and was built 55 years ago to host important guests from overseas. According to the presidential office, the two spent more than 2 hours talking freely about culture and sports and took a stroll around the garden inside the residence. The Japanese Prime Minister told President Yoon that he's excited to hear Yoon's thoughts on his global agenda during the upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima. As for the menu, 10 of the dishes that have been revealed include the sweet potato noodle dish, japchae, braised beef short ribs or galbijjim, and bulgogi, which is marinated grilled beef, all made from special locally sourced ingredients. Everything on the list is Korean food that would normally be presented to a guest for a special occasion. As for Kishida's second and last day in Seoul, he started by meeting ranking members of the South Korea-Japan Parliamentarians Association. Representing the ruling People Power Party was Chung Jin-seok, with Yoon Ho-jung from the main opposition, the Democratic Party of Korea, making it a meeting with lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. Also, Kishida met with 6 business organization leaders for some tea just prior to his departure from Seoul. Included in that meeting is Choi Tae-won, the chairman of SK Group, who is also the current chief of the Korean Chamber of Commerce. Kim Do-young, Arirang News.
Seoul and Washington are gearing up to lay out the foundations of a bilateral chip alliance in a follow-up to their recent state summit. Our Lee Dae-yeon has the details.
South Korea is aiming for stronger ties with the United States in the semiconductor sector. Measures to follow up President Yoon Suk-yeol's visit to Washington last month were discussed during a ministerial meeting on Monday presided over by Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho. Chu highlighted the chip industry, saying that Seoul and Washington will lay out the foundations of the bilateral chip alliance based on cooperative projects on next-generation chips, high-tech packaging, and chip material, parts, and equipment. Chip forums between the public and private sectors will also be set up. In terms of the U.S. CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, he mentioned that the two countries are working to reduce the burden and uncertainties faced by South Korean businesses as a consequence of both acts. The finance minister said close consultation on the matter will continue so that it can eventually become a win-win for both Seoul and Washington. Chu also pledged to strengthen ties in advanced technology industries.
We will develop cooperation in the chip, battery, bio, quantum, and digital sectors by establishing a next-generation critical and emerging technologies dialogue led by national security advisors in the second half of this year.
The minister added domestic clusters related to these industries will be further developed, and he will actively engage in putting to work the $5.9 billion of investments secured by President Yoon during his trip to the U.S. The finance ministry also revealed plans to focus on overseas construction projects, factories, nuclear power plants, and eco-friendly businesses in order to reach its target of $35 billion in overseas orders this year. He said he will once again ramp up government-to-government cooperation to win contracts on mega projects such as Saudi's Neom City and the construction of Indonesia's new capital city. To do this, he will provide diplomatic and financial support for these large-scale plant projects in the Middle East, while expanding eco-friendly businesses related to green hydrogen and cutting greenhouse gases. Lee Dae-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korea is looking to set up several innovative tech clusters across the country. The Ministry of SMEs and Startups announced on Monday that it will create 10 global innovative zones by 2027 for SMEs in the high-tech sector. These zones will be operated as innovative tech clusters where companies will be allowed to demonstrate all types of new technology other than those that are explicitly restricted. This comes after the South Korea-U.S. Cluster Roundtable was held during President Yoon's state visit to the U.S. 2 or 3 clusters will first launch this year in collaboration with universities, research centers, and global corporations. As South Korea continues to grapple with slumping exports, the nation's economy is seemingly being kept afloat thanks to a rebound in domestic demand. The monthly economic trends report released by the Korea Development Institute on Monday showed that the value of exports last month dropped by 14.2% compared to the same month last year. This was attributed to the sharp decline in semiconductor exports, with semiconductor production falling by nearly 27% on year. However, domestic demand has increased in the auto and travel sector. Car sales rose by 14.5% in March on year, while the travel and transportation sector saw around 18% jump in sales. South Korea's inflation is showing signs of cooling, but food prices continue to see major hikes, putting much burden on people, especially during this month of May, where there are many occasions when people dine out with their families to celebrate events on the calendar. Kim Yeon-sung has the details.
Inflation has slowed recently, but food prices are still climbing, putting a strain on consumers' wallets. According to Statistics Korea on Monday, the inflation rate for consumer prices dropped to 3.7% last month, falling below 4% for the first time in more than a year. But the cost of dining out has increased by a massive 7.6% in April, compared to a year earlier. That's more than double the overall rate, putting the gap between the inflation of dining out costs and the average inflation rate at its widest level in 31 years. Processed foods also saw a high inflation rate of almost 8%. Nearly 30% of food items saw an inflation rate of above 10% last month. Prices for jams and dressings have skyrocketed by more than 30%, while some food items such as cheese, pasta noodles, and fish cakes have seen price increases of more than 20% from the previous year. These price hikes for essential goods and services are hitting the wallets of consumers who are already struggling in a tough economic climate. Kim Hyun-seung, Arirang News.
Over in London, the historic coronation ceremony of King Charles III took place on Sunday, bringing attention from all around the country and the world. Lee Seung-jae breaks down its popularity in terms of viewership.
You might expect a historic event like the coronation of King Charles III to be a huge draw for people in the UK tuning in on TV. But how many switched on to watch? According to audience measurement group Barb on Sunday, the King's coronation was watched by an average of 18.8 million viewers across 11 channels and services. With the broadcast of the ceremony itself taking place from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. local time, viewership peaked just after midday, with 20.4 million viewers when King Charles III was officially crowned. With visible anti-monarchy protests coinciding with the ceremony, it appears public sentiment toward the royal family is changing. King Charles III's coronation was watched by significantly fewer people than Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, which garnered some 26.5 million viewers. Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 is believed to have been watched by millions, but no reliable figures are available. Although surveys by BBC at the time estimated that over 20 million people had watched the event. Also, some British channels even opted to not air the event. For instance, Channel 4 decided to show Johnny English Strikes Again with an average of 138,000 people preferring to watch the film rather than the coronation. Channel 5 meanwhile decided to entertain kids with the adventures of Paddington Bear and SpongeBob SquarePants. Still, many across the UK celebrated King Charles III's coronation with a so-called big lunch, which brought neighbors and communities together to share friendship, food, and fun. In fact, 50,000 venues held such an event, with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hosting a big lunch at 10 Downing Street. US First Lady Joe Biden, along with her granddaughter, attended the event hosted by the Prime Minister, with Ukrainian refugees, youth group members, and community volunteers also invited. A coronation concert was also held at 8 p.m. on the East Lawn of Windsor Castle, with names like Take That, Katy Perry, Lionel Richie, and Andrea Bocelli performing. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
At least 27 people have died in a fire at a gold mine in southern Peru. Local reports say the fire broke out on Saturday in a tunnel inside a gold mine in southern Arequipa region. According to the BBC, 175 miners were rescued. Local government officials said an electrical short circuit may have caused the fire. Peru is one of the world's largest gold producers, accounting for about 4% of the world's annual gold supply. Deaths in the country's mining industry are not unusual. However, the latest incident is believed to be Peru's worst single disaster since 2000.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Ukraine, Russia's Wagner group has said it would keep fighting to capture the city of Bakhmut. The group had previously said it would pull out of the city, but appears to have changed its decision. This, according to a new audio message by the head of the paramilitary organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin. In it, he said Russia's military leadership promised Wagner on Sunday that it would send as many weapons as needed to capture the city in eastern Ukraine. The audio clip comes a day after Prigozhin claimed in another message that his forces have captured 95% of Bakhmut. Prigozhin criticized the Russian military's top brass in a video message on Friday. Standing in front of dozens of dead soldiers, he said that tens of thousands of Russian troop casualties were due to a lack of ammunition support from Moscow, and threatened to pull his forces from the region by May 10th. Syria has been readmitted into the Arab League 12 years after its membership was revoked. At the organization's headquarters in Cairo on Sunday local time, foreign ministers voted for Syria's return to the body. Syria was thrown out in 2011 after its brutal suppression of protests against President Bashar al-Assad, which led to an ongoing civil war and a refugee and drug smuggling crisis. The reinstatement has been criticized by the US and the UK. But the Arab League has defended its move, saying that it aims to end Syria's civil war using a special committee. Consisting of 22 member states, the goal of the Arab League is to integrate members economically and solve conflicts among members without foreign assistance. Moving over to the U.S. state of Texas, a driver has been arrested after an SUV plowed into a crowd of people, killing 7. The incident occurred near the border town of Brownsville on Sunday local time. Video from the scene shows the driver ran through a traffic light and struck the crowd waiting at a bus stop outside a migrant shelter. Some pedestrians walking by were also hit. Reports say 10 others were wounded. Most of the victims were Venezuelan men waiting outside the shelter. The driver was apprehended by witnesses while attempting to flee and is now in police custody. Authorities are investigating whether the crash was done intentionally. And finally, more than 200,000 athletes around the world took part in one of the world's largest charity runs on Sunday. Called the Wings for Life World Run, it was the 10th edition of the event, with all proceeds being donated to spinal cord research. Participants in 158 different countries all started simultaneously at 11 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Runners had no finish line but had to compete with a virtual catcher car that started chasing runners 30 minutes after the start signal. The furthest distance achieved by a male runner before being caught was by Japan's Joe Fukuda, who won the event for the second time, running a total of 69.01 kilometers. The furthest distance by a female runner was 55.07 kilometers by Kasia Szkoda of Poland. The run raised almost $6.4 million for charity. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. After some rough weather we had over the Children's Day weekend under murky skies, heavy rain with strong winds, we are having a pleasant Parents' Day weather today. Breezy morning temperatures are jumping to the 20s with sunshine all day long. In fact, sunlight might be too strong during the day. Sunblock and sunglasses are a must to protect yourself from the nasty UV rays. Not much to complain about weather-wise today, with even air quality forecast to be good to normal nationwide all day. Daily highs in most parts are 3 to 7 degrees higher than yesterday, hovering above 20 degrees Celsius this afternoon. And if you need to, you should go for a car wash today. The weather outlook for this week looks good and promising with the sunshine. Top temperatures will be staying slightly above season norms. Just be aware of big temperature differences between lows and highs and do dress accordingly. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of the day.